We're just going to kick off in a minute or two. We're just waiting for people to pop in. So, for those of you who have joined, we have a full stack today. It is spooky season, so what topic could I think of? No other than compliance. But before we get into it, I want to just run through a few housekeeping items to make sure that we're all aware of the rules of the road today. So one, this is being recorded. Transcription and closed captioning is available as needed. So if you look at that fun little ribbon at the bottom, you will see the closed caption icon. Please click on that for that service. As I said, this is being recorded, so if you would like to share this with your colleagues after, please do. It will also be available on demand, so it's coming to an email near you right after this session, as well as being uploaded to YouTube tomorrow. So feel free to like or add comments. Got questions and comments? Please use, again, that ribbon at the bottom. There is a Q&A function that I will be keeping track of. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. And if you have a comment that you would like to address with everybody in the group, please feel free to put it in the chat. As always, at the end of this, all attendees will receive certifications that can be used towards CPE credits. I know how valuable those are for those of you that are on today and taking the time out of their busy days. So we want to make sure you are rewarded with those credits. And lastly, at the end of this, we do appreciate feedback. We want to make sure that we are providing the best community content. It's relevant, it's timely, it's topical. So please take time to fill out the quick few questions survey at the end. Without further ado, let's get into it. So today's community webinar is brought to you by the Spectra Collective. That's our community arm here at Reversing Labs. Excuse me, sorry. Got a little cold going around. It is brought to you by Secure Software. So that is our free tool that is here for the open source community. So what does this have to do with today's topic? Open source, as we all know and love, there is many fine parts that go into this, and compliance is just one. And where you have many people involved, compliance can get a little hairy, and so can't regulations. So that's why today I'm excited that we have a great panel of experts here with us. So I'm not going to I'm not going to waste the thunder and introduce them, but Russ Ealing, would you like to go first to introduce
Sure.
yourself, let the folks at home get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. Hi, everyone. For those unfamiliar with me, I'm the founder of OSS Consultants. We're a business that's dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes manage their use of open source software. We help organizations with scanning and audit services, producing SBOMs, M&A due diligence audits, as well as building entire open source governance programs. Before starting the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. I had responsibility for designing and implementing a successful open source governance program at GM, which was among the first of its kind at that scale in 2012. So as the open source compliance officer, I built the open source governance program that was responsible for reviewing all software and every part used in every GM vehicle anywhere in the world.
That alone just makes my heart like skip a few beats. Just thinking of all the software that goes into cars nowadays, especially when you think of just how many sensors that have software back to them. So we're talking millions at that point. So that's crazy. And thank you for taking the time to be here with your expertise today, Russ.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Faith, would you like to introduce yourself for the folks at home, please?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for inviting me to participate today. My name is Faith Kasparian, and I lead the data protection team at a law firm called Morse in the Boston area. I am also a licensing commercial contracts lawyer. For many years, I represented and still represent software developers and licensors.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited that we have someone who is an expert today on the panel who, literally lives, breathes, and works with software and these developers day in, day out, especially from the legal perspective. Ryan, I know you know Faith, but why don't you tell the folks at home a little bit about who you are and why you're here today?
Hi, I'm Ryan Perry. I'm also a partner at Morse in the data protection and commercial contracts practice groups. I advise businesses on all stages of the software development lifecycle from, how to protect their IP in commercial contracts, in their customer agreements, and then how to comply with various data protection laws that apply to their databases.
And I think what we'll get into today, and I'm not going to steal the show, but especially with emerging AI, data protection is a big thing, especially when we're looking at how it flows. And we'll get into a little bit about that later. But, thank you so much for being here along with your expertise with Faith. Appreciate the time. So now that everybody knows who we have on the panel today, let's get into today's topic. Today, we're going to do things a little bit different just because we have such an expert panel that's diverse in what they know. So what we've decided to do is we're going to break out the first part into a little bit more technical and then the second part a little bit more legal, right? Because this is not just a developer problem, a legal problem anymore. This is really everybody who participates in the software development lifecycle. So today, we're really focused on the developer and how you can work with your legal teams to better understand compliance. So Russ, I'd like to kick things off with you. What are the biggest myths that developers have about open source compliance, especially, I feel like a lot of times they're like, oh, it's not my problem, or they only call me when something goes wrong. So if I'm in legal's office, this is horrible. So what would you say, as someone who has stood up this type of organization, thrived with it, what are some of the biggest myths that developers have about this?
So open source is free, but I think a myth is that it's free of obligations. So
Yeah.
Even if you're only using permissively licensed open source, you still have obligations in most cases to at least produce copies of licenses and their copyright notices to the end user. Even if you're using non-permissive open source licenses, you typically have additional obligations that have to be carefully managed. So some of those obligations often include source redistribution requirements, which in some cases may impact your IP and your software. So again, this needs to be carefully managed so that any risk is understood, and ideally it should be understood early. Another myth is that open source, or more specifically, open source licensing is limited only to dependencies instead of also source and snippets of code. So many people think that scanning or analyzing a manifest file on its own is sufficient. At best, this typically lists only the direct top-level dependencies a project needs, not the entire sort of nested dependencies or transitive dependencies. So there's a few issues with this. If any license information has been provided for each dependency in a manifest, and that's a big if, it's typically applicable only to the top-level dependency, and in many cases, it's wrong. So that's because so much of today's open source has been reused, recycled, recombined with other open source. Most often, there's more than one license that applies, or perhaps the incorrect license was identified in the metadata. So on top of this, then you also have the nested dependencies, transitive dependencies that could each have at least one other license, perhaps different copyright notices as well. Closely related to that, the myth that top-level licensing is the only thing that matters, or the only license that applies. So similar to the last example, you may see a project is under a big permissive license like Apache 2.0, but the project uses lots of other open source that has other license types, other copyright notices, and other licensing obligations beyond those that are required for just Apache 2.0. I'm sure we'll get into AI, but I'll just quickly say that another myth is that using AI-generated code doesn't have any copyright or license compliance obligations. So I'm sure we'll get into that. You asked about these developer myths, though, in the context of when things go wrong. So things can go wrong anytime during development. It gets more difficult when software is released or is close to release, because it's typically more difficult to remediate at that point. So there can be a mad scramble to remove and replace open source that has problematic licenses, which usually takes time since the product still has to actually work and be tested, minor details. Closely related to this is the presence of unlicensed or inadequately licensed software, including commercial software. So we'll often find software that specifically says not for commercial use or academic use only, which is clearly a problem if you're a commercial entity. Another inopportune time would be to find these during an M&A scan or audit. Ideally, you'd want to see this during a pre-M&A scan or audit if we happen to be working for the target company.
Yeah. That's a lot to think about all at one time. And then, what I think is crazy is you're trying to keep all these rules straight, like of what licenses, what package does it go into, what project is a part of, what supersedes what. So those are just, day in, day out, like licensing obligations, right? But what about regulations? So there's things like, the EU Cyber Resilience Act, Executive 14028 we have here in the US that are kind of reshaping that day-to-day development work, including OSPO, and how they're guiding teams. How is that working out? What level is that another layer of complication that adds to an OSPO's job or developers' jobs when they are looking at these different components and trying to figure out compliance issues?
Yeah, it's certainly adding a lot more focus. So all of our clients globally, they've been impacted by at least one of these, as well as other regulations. And they've asked us to support some level of SBOM activity, depending on what their requirements might be for their industries or from their customers. At a high level, the U.S. Executive Order 14028 calls for SBOMs to be delivered for any software provided to the US federal government. On top of that, there's also specific regulations in the healthcare and automotive industries, as well as others, that also require SBOMs. EU Cyber Resilience Act imposes cybersecurity standards and requires developers to provide SBOMs for products with digital components. So companies that are using open source have to ensure any of their software products that have digital elements comply with these new frameworks and requirements, and they have to provide transparent information about the open source components used. So this applies not just to companies in the EU, but also to any company providing software products with digital elements to the EU. So regardless of where they're based or where the software was developed. So this concept of knowing what open source you're using is really reshaping this day-to-day development and related work, with the increased focus of not just producing an SBOM, but making sure that the SBOM is comprehensive and accurate for its purpose.
Now, how is AI complicating compliance? Because we alluded to it earlier, so let's dive into that. That's another layer of, just kind of complicating compliance here.
Sure. So, I mean, when it comes to AI generated code, we should definitely be thinking about what was generated and how any open source may have been used in that generation, whether as dependencies, source, or even as snippets of code. As I mentioned earlier, there are license obligations, license compliance obligations for almost every use of open source. So that said, managing license compliance with AI generated code it's newish ground, and then it has challenges that aren't really being fully considered yet by some organizations. There's a traceability aspect. So even when prompted to include license compliance, AI generated code often lacks clear provenance, which can also result in incomplete notices and attributions, as well as other license violations and security vulnerabilities. Most AI solutions for developers don't currently disclose information about the origins and licenses of the source code that they produce as an output, though there are a couple that provide at least some information. From a practical perspective, and this is one of the more common things that my audit team is seeing these days. If you look at the average volume of source that we're scanning these days, we're seeing far more use of open source than in past years. But we're also seeing fewer of the required license attributions, or without the full licensing picture. Again, mainly just top level, if at all, and hopefully it's correct. But just interesting shift with the advent of AI.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely interesting data right there. Why do you think there is that shift?
Well, so if it's AI generated code, a lot of it's being used.
Yeah.
The provenance isn't there, like I mentioned earlier, so
Right.
they don't really know where it came from or what other licenses might apply. So, I mean, it just puts in whatever it was
Yeah.
trained on, which typically is incomplete. So we're seeing more volume from the AI generation, but less comprehensive on the license compliance front.
That's an interesting one. I mean, I feel like Ryan and Faith, I might ask you a little bit more about that later and how, that works out, because that's an interesting one that I honestly wasn't expecting. Um, Interesting. So what practical steps can organizations, take early in their software development life cycle to bake in these compliance standards by default? What principles should they be looking at to kind of guide them on this journey so that way when there is an audit, it's not like a fire drill, someone's crying or worried about being fired. You know what I mean? It's kind of like okay, like we know we have to do this and let's move on.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing this huge rise, right? This exponential rise in the number of dependencies and transitive dependencies. So it's just not practical anymore to just tell a developer to keep their eye out for potentially problematic licenses. There's just too much. But I mean, it's better than nothing. So developers should certainly be aware of what they're using where possible. But the reality is, with every release, someone somewhere is making decisions about the license compliance, coming from your use of open source. So you're either fully complying, partially complying.
Yeah.
So, for example, like just top level information, or not complying at all. So, from a risk perspective, it makes way more sense to know what you're shipping, so that you're at least informed of the potential risks. Um, Perhaps an oversimplified practical step is to start somewhere, but ideally you want to start early. I don't think anyone's expecting a developer to become a license compliance expert. So ideally, you should have someone in your organization that has a deeper understanding, like someone in an open source program office role or OSPO role. Um, Almost all companies that distribute or provide software should have an OSPO or need an OSPO, or at least someone to fill those functions, even if they don't use the OSPO label or the OSPO title. So this can absolutely be a team of one or even a part-time person. Outsourcing the function is also an option. We offer a service to either become your OSPO or provide temporary expertise to help get you started. Um, Other basics are to establish a formal open source strategy, develop an open source policy, and also a process for managing the open source you use. Staying informed of what's happening in this space is another really simple, practical step. Again, a fairly simple one. You can follow us, follow OSS Consultants on LinkedIn. Several times a week, we post tips, industry news, and practical guidance on how you can better manage your use of open source. So that includes SBOMs, license compliance, as well as supply chain security.
I do like those tips that you provide too, because you meet people at different stages of the journey, right? And you have to understand that some people may be more mature in this journey, but some people might be kind of middle of the road where, like, yeah, they know kind of what's going on, but it's like, how do you move forward and shape that strategy, given where you're at? Or some people are just like, I don't even know where to start. So it's great that you have such a breadth of knowledge that you're sharing with people. Um,
Thanks.
yeah, no, I love it. So, are there best practices for governance and compliance that can help enterprises? Because I know we talked a little bit about, smaller mid-sized companies, where they can put a person in there. I think, we've seen some of these larger companies, yes, they have an OSPO. But what best practices in governance, would you recommend to them? I mean, you ran it at GM, so I'm sure you know where bodies are buried or best practices that should be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, for compliance, or at least open source license compliance, I mentioned it earlier. My strong recommendation is to know what open source you're using. Um, this typically requires tooling, some type of software composition analysis tooling. You need an inventory of your open source for license compliance, to do SBOM reporting. It can help with understanding and addressing security risks. So for me, this is one of the biggest opportunities for a lot of organizations. Um, On the governance side, there's, for external help or outside guidance, there's OpenChain, ISO 5230. So OpenChain is part of the Linux Foundation. The ISO standard defines the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program, and then it builds trust around the open source supply chain by promoting that transparency. So this standard is limited to what an open source program should have and why it should have it, but it avoids the how and the when. OSS Consultants is an official partner of OpenChain. We've helped a number of companies with various stages of attaining conformance to ISO 5230, including BlackBerry, which was the first enterprise-wide conformance to ISO 5230, and also the first enterprise-wide conformance with an official OpenChain partner. There was a case study that the Linux Foundation published about this. Katie, I think you'll include the link as one of the webinar
I
resources.
just popped it into the chat right now.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So, check that out if you want to see an example of how OpenChain was implemented in a large organization.
Yeah, I think the OpenChain project is really interesting, and especially having a company like BlackBerry where there had been issues in the past to get them compliant is a pretty big deal. So for those of you at home, I would check out that case study just for an awareness point of view to better understand what OpenChain is, and the standards that they can provide, and really that recommendation. Russ, I think my last question before we kind of pivot over to the legal folks here, is who owns compliance? That's always the big question, right? Because I feel like a lot of times it's like, oh, not my problem. I'm going to pass the buck. It's legal. So is it legal? We've talked about OSPO, but we've also talked about engineering. So who owns it?
Yeah. So in my experience, this function is most often with one or more of three organizations. So typically it's either engineering, security, or the product business unit. Yep. In the past, this function, like way back, this function might have been seen more in legal, not nearly as common anymore. I think use of open source has just grown too much to have lawyers pouring through lists of tens of thousands of open source components. Collaboration, I think that comes together when you think of governance, whether that's an OSPO or other type of open source governance structure, as a system. So you mentioned legal and engineering, but I would also add to that security, and then to some degree, the purchasing organization. Yeah. So this system, it doesn't have to be big, or it doesn't have to be staffed by dedicated people. They all work together, but it has to be orchestrated. We do that with process, which provides the policy as its guardrails. But as Katie mentioned earlier, if you're not sure where to start with a process or policy or anything that I've discussed today, please feel free to reach out anytime. I'd be happy to help clarify anything or get you pointed in the right direction.
Thanks, Ross. So, switching gears a little bit, right? Still staying on brand, on theme. Ryan and Faith, I saw you both nodding your heads several times when Russ was talking. So is there anything, you want to add on to any of the brilliant points that Russ kind of shared with us today?
Go ahead, Faith.
I just wanted to echo that the first time you want to be understanding what open source components you have in your software is not at the time you're hoping to sell the company or get investment. You really want to be ahead of this and being really meticulous in terms of your documentation of what open source components are in the software.
Yeah.
It's funny, Faith and I have been working together so long, it's exactly what I was going to say.
You guys got ESP, huh? Not ESPN, maybe next week. So, all right. So from a legal perspective, what's the most serious compliance mistake you've seen in code bases, whether it's related to license infringement, risk allocation between, license source and licensees, or maybe a viral license terms that's quietly spread through the code? And we might need you to explain some of these terms for those at home too, as we kind of go through this. So Ryan, could you help me out with this?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two issues here, one on the code base side and one on the database side. So on the code base side, I think the risks are any of your in licenses. And it's not just open source, but on the open source side, the real boogeyman is the viral terms, right? You've you've licensed in a whole bunch of code from under the AGPL, for example, and you didn't know that it was in there, and it's sort of fundamental to your code, right? And then all of a sudden, you don't have the rights in your code that you thought you did because you have an obligation under the license to make it open source. That's really bad. Um,
Yeah.
but I think on the private license side too, even if you're purchasing snippets of code that you're going to embed in your technology, um, you need to know the scope of that license pretty well, because if you exceed the scope of the license, if you're not allowed to distribute it in the way that you're distributing it, or if you're, not allowed to use it for a certain purpose, that can be really bad too. And all of those things are gonna come out when you go to do a corporate transaction. You're going to have a buyer or an investor pouring through all of this, and it's not going to stay, swept under the rug. It's going to come up. On the database side, I think the biggest risk is, you have a whole bunch of data that you want to train an AI model with or something, and it turns out that that data has not been properly anonymized, and it's identifiable. And not only is it identifiable, it's regulated. And you're not complying with the regulations that apply to the data when you're training the model. Um, that can be a problem too. It's a very different kind of problem. But I think, being thoughtful about it's sort of like eating your vegetables in a sense, like you have to be thoughtful about what you put in your body, you have to be thoughtful about what you put into your technology. And it's sort of, I think, a similar way of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's fair because you want to keep it like a well-oiled machine, but it has to have the right parts, the right maintenance to make sure it is going well, just like your body, to your point.
Mhm.
Um, when you brought up the viral license thing of being aware, it just makes me think of when I think it was Cisco. And they had a router problem a few years back, and it became OpenWRT because they had a license issue, and then it had to become open source software. So
Mhm.
even the big guys can get it wrong
Yeah,
sometimes.
yeah, this comes up from time to time in kind of big splashy headlines, but you know, um, it it is a genuine risk out there, because the folks that write these licenses, the viral licenses, this is their goal. I mean, the whole idea of the monetized internet was anathema to them, and this was sort of their hand grenade into it. So that's why, you have to be careful, because this is the purpose behind which those licenses were drafted.
Yeah. Russ, I saw you nodding. Did you have something to comment on? I was just like, you might have a story here.
Uh, Not really a story. Just, I mean, I think the Cisco case that was in, I think, 2008. There's been several since
Yeah.
that were similar in nature. Tesla was one with their
Hmm.
autopilot program. Uh, Vizio televisions currently. There's a case with the GPL license open source in some of their smart TVs today. So, as Brian mentioned, there's lots of examples.
Yeah. You just go find them, guys.
Yep.
Those of you at home, they're there. That was just the one I immediately think of, though, because I just remember the headline. Um, so how should an organization handle risk, allocation when it comes to open source use, particularly around when third-party claims arise? What should the developer and legal teams know about indemnity or reimbursed obligations?
So the idea here is developer creates some type of software for a customer. That software incorporates some open source software. Something goes awry and a third party sues the customer because of the open source components or some other problem with the software. The question is, who's going to be responsible for that? And what will the developer need to reimburse or pay the customer? So when I'm representing the software developer, my first kind of position is with respect to open source software to identify what open source components are used, and then ideally have the customer be responsible for directly entering into the terms of the relevant license. When I shared this response with Ryan, he thought, wow, you're a great negotiator. I don't know that I could get that. So Ryan, do you want to say what your fallback position would be if you can't achieve that,
Yeah.
taking the risk onto the customer approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the customer's going to say, "You're the developer. You're writing this for us. We're buying a product from you. You need to be responsible for what you're building for us." And in that situation, I think diligence is your best defense. You need to know very well what what you're putting into the code that you're providing to the customer, and make sure that the licenses that um, that you are leveraging don't uh, contain viral terms or things of that nature. I think, from the compliance side, like the obligation to comply with the software licenses that do apply, once you furnish that to the customer as the developer, that's reasonable that the customer should be on the hook to comply with the license terms. But I think from the customer's perspective, am I getting a bunch of code that has been contaminated by the AGPL? I would want the developer to be on the hook for that if
Yeah.
I were the customer.
I don't know. What do you at home on the line think? Should it be? Should it be the, developer customer on the hook? Let us know in the chat. So, carrying on with this, I like that we have two different answers because sometimes, to Ryan's point, you can't always be that great of a negotiator or you just can't get that, right? That is able to do. So it's good to have, a variety of different avenues you can explore, right? And just not locked into one lane. So my question is, to help you with these types of different obligations, you know, are there tools that people can use to help, licensee agree to what they comply from, or is there anything of that nature that can help with understanding where those licenses are or obligations?
Well, I think that's really a question maybe for Russ.
Mm,
Um, and he talked earlier about the scans. So
yep.
really identifying what's in the software. And he also talked about documentation of the open source components, having a policy requiring that governance and documentation, and then really understanding what the applicable licenses are and what the obligations are under those licenses.
Just wanted to double check to make sure, there's no difference as to what you're looking for in those scans. Russ, anything to add? I know we went through it before, but anything to add?
No, it's covered. It's all good. Thanks.
So, how can developers and product teams embed privacy by design principles? I think that's another thing that we're seeing a lot lately in the market is hearing privacy by design, and ensuring that data protection compliance is there, as well as reducing exposure, to those evolving privacy laws. So, Faith, I know that we had previously spoken about this, but I'd love to be able to hear a little bit about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. So now we're kind of pivoting a little bit into understanding more, not necessarily exclusively open source risks in software. What are privacy risks in software development? And this concept of privacy by design, very similar to something that Russ mentioned earlier in his component about how you want to bake in open source compliance standards by default. We want to bake in privacy protections by default from the very beginning, from the earliest nascent stages of the software development. So this was a term, privacy by design,
Yeah.
coined by Anne Kavukian. Now, she is another Armenian woman privacy attorney like me. She was the head of Canada's information and privacy supervisory authority. She was a commissioner and she coined this phrase in the 90s. So the idea is you don't think about privacy after the fact. It's a default setting built in from the ground up. This concept has actually been reflected in certain laws. The European comprehensive data protection regulation. The GDPR reflects it. Canada's PIPEDA, their overarching privacy legislation, reflects it. And it's definitely a best practice. So under this privacy by design philosophy, you build in privacy to the technology, in the design, the operation management of the information technology systems, processes, and practices, and in the technical design. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
So there are certain concepts called fair information practices. And you want to consider those fair information practices in the design of your technology. Those practices are transparency, making sure you have appropriate notices to individuals about what data may be collected, individual participation, giving folks some kind of choice about what data will or won't be collected from them and transferred, let's say, to the licensor. And you want to set the privacy choice by default in a way that's more privacy protective. So automatically maybe turned off for sending the data to the licensor unless the user expressly checks it to have it be sent. Purpose specification. So articulating what are the purposes for which you're collecting the data and not collecting the data for other purposes. Data minimization, collecting only what you need consistent with that purpose. Security, having really strong security for the software, for the data that's being collected, super important in the IoT world in particular. And then having some accountability and auditing. So constantly kind of reassessing, have things changed, and confirming that the data practices are still consistent. So the idea is that by emphasizing data protection and data minimization, starting from the kind of earliest phases, that you're going to reduce exposure and overall risk, rather than thinking of privacy as something you add on kind of at the end. And I think you had also kind of queried at one point, how might a developer work with a legal team to kind of facilitate this? So get the legal team involved early and start discussing these fair information practices with respect to the software. Maybe they need to do a data protection impact assessment to really understand, is the developer, is the product or technology collecting no more data than is necessary? And you want to make sure to educate your legal team. Let them know the facts. What data is being collected? How is it being used? Who are the third parties with whom the data is being shared? Because your legal team or a privacy consultant, they can't support you if they don't have all the information. But idea is, by considering privacy by design, you're going to reduce overall risk.
You know, one idea on that too, schedule a half hour with your lawyers and give them a demo of the product. That will be the best half hour you ever spent with your lawyers. Because whenever I get a demo of my clients' products and I really understand how the product works, I can, represent them so much better.
I love that, because you're creating a true business partnership there, right? Like, it's not just, they're shoving it over the wall and hoping legal understands. It's really a true partnership where legal is educating them on, what the laws are and regulations are, but then they're also educating the legal team as to, like, this is how the product works, this is how data is collected, this is where it goes. So you're able to really educate both of each other and have that mutual impact together. So I really like that approach. Also, I'm a big fan of privacy by design and just having that as like a first thing. And Faith, to your point, it's not an add-on, right? It shouldn't be bolted on later, just like compliance shouldn't be, like Russ was talking about. It's not Frankenstein. You're not adding it on later. You need to have it thought of when it's being baked. So I just really liked how you laid that out. So thank you. Um, you know, under EU law, we've talked a little bit about privacy by design, and Ryan, we've talked a little bit about data. Under EU law, how should teams be navigating, the data localization obligations and safeguard that transferring? So Russ had talked about transferring of those digital goods earlier, and it doesn't matter where they're made, if they're going to the EU, right? Like there's a transfer of goods going on there and you're subject to it. So can you just walk me through how people should be navigating and really safeguarding that transfer?
Yeah, there are limitations on transfers on the data side as well.
Hmm.
But they mostly emanate from Europe going to the United States as opposed to the United States going to Europe. So
Sorry.
in Europe, um, they're as part of the GDPR, you are not allowed to transfer data to jurisdictions that don't have adequate data protection laws, and that would include the United States under as determined by the European Commission, without having certain safeguards in place. Before we get to the safeguards, just want to give a heads up. A transfer is very broad. I find a lot of software developers say, "Oh, well, we're hosting everything in Germany, so there's no transfer." But then they're accessing all of the data from the United States. If you're able to render identifiable data from Europe on a screen in the United States, that's a transfer.
Hmm.
So, so if there is a transfer, how do you deal with that? There are various mechanisms under EU and US law too, called data transfer mechanisms. So one of them you might have heard of is the standard contractual clauses. So these are contracts that the European Commission has blessed. You can't really deviate from them. They have very specific obligations that apply to the data. They're designed to give the data the same protection they would have under EU law when it's transferred to the United States or to any other inadequate jurisdiction. Another way to transfer data is this partnership between the European Union and the United States called the Data Privacy Framework. This is a framework that the company would self-certify to. They would get, they would submit their self-certification and then they would be part of the list. And under that framework, you can transfer data. Although there have been challenges to that framework, so question how long will continue. It is the third attempt between the EU and the US to have such a framework. The first two went down in flames.
Third time's a charm, got to be optimistic here.
um, those are sort of the two probably most common for most businesses, data transfer mechanisms that would apply. And at the end of the day, uh, I think there's a bit of a geopolitical tug of war here, and software providers are caught in the middle. Because the whole purpose here is from the EU perspective, is to make sure that European law will continue um, to protect data. But a lot of times, or sometimes, that comes into conflict with US laws, particularly US laws dealing with national security or surveillance. Um, and there is a very, it's probably not likely for most businesses, but in certain industries, it could be likely if you're in the telecom industry where you get competing obligations where, you have a subpoena from the US government to produce a lot of data that's regulated and you're not supposed to do that um, under EU law. In those sort of in those sort of sensitive situations, EU law requires supplemental measures be imposed on the data, things like encryption and, the key not being accessible to the receiving party and, things of that nature. But at the end of the day, a company could be caught in the middle, and that can be really awkward, particularly if there's a EU customer on the other end. So I think just bearing in mind and knowing your data transfers really well and knowing what's coming from where and when, so that you can kind of get ahead of it if an issue like that were to arise.
Yeah. Faith, I saw you nodding along.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chime in. So, like, that's a sort of explanation of the transfer of data, like from EU to US or other jurisdictions that aren't considered adequate. So the US does have some technology localization requirements and data localization requirements. So that on the technology side, export control requirements where certain types of technology can't be exported to certain jurisdictions. And then more recently, data localization requirements where certain types of data or quantum of data can't be shared with certain jurisdictions of concern, or in some cases, particular parties. So
Yeah.
I think that Ryan's point, the best thing that you can do is understand ahead where's the data going to be going with respect to the software, based on where the licensees are or customers or what have you. And then you'll need to discuss with your legal team what obligations attach to the various types of data flows and transfers.
Great answer. So we've talked a bit about, from the legal perspective, serious compliance mistakes you can make, how you should handle that risk allocation, what does privacy by design looks like and what that data transfer looks like. Can you give me a real world example? I mean, we are in October, it is spooky season. So can you share a real world example of where a compliance or a privacy failure led to infringement claims, or maybe a data transfer violation or an M&A complication? I'd be curious to know what your spooky story is and how it impacted developers. Like, what can you learn from this?
Yeah, I think folks might be surprised to learn that the biggest risk I see is transaction risk. Um, there's sort of two components to it. There's corporate and commercial. But I think on the corporate side, I've seen issues with data protection compliance. Folks that just really had their head in the sand, did not implement that privacy by design philosophy in the slightest, didn't think about it at all. Go to sell the company, surprised to learn that there are laws that apply to the data they handle. And sometimes it can cause you know uh, exceptions to the R&W insurance, the rep and warranty insurance, which could lead to the sellers being responsible for holdbacks, special indemnities, purchase price adjustments. I mean, this is cash out of the pocket of the seller, right? Um, or worse, if it's really bad, if it's really fundamental to the company, and this is really an issue that could come up on the IP side, where, if you want to talk about the code base and the in-license risk we talk about, if there's viral terms that infect the code to an extent that it can't really be mitigated, or if there's potential infringement, that can even risk the deal entirely. Um, you know, I think on the privacy side, the best remedy is address compliance early and often. On the code base side, it's probably similar, and you want to get ahead of your buyer's Black Duck review. You don't want to be receiving the Black Duck report from your buyer and with a question, what's going on here, and not have an answer.
Yeah, that's fair.
And
Faith?
just a little bit on the commercial contracts or commercial risk. If you haven't been attentive to certain data protection issues, especially if you're selling into large enterprise, if it's a B2B model, the large enterprise is going to start asking questions. And you really don't want to be confronting those questions in your first big negotiation. And it signals a lack of sophistication, it doesn't inspire confidence, and you're going to need to get your house in order, so that large enterprise can do business with you, because their compliance is at risk if you can't comply with certain laws that attach to the data that may be processed by the software that you're developing. Just another kind of real world example, not maybe as likely, but there is regulatory risk. I mean, we've talked about transaction risk, both from, selling the company or the commercial side. But, I've seen early stage companies where, let's say a choice is given to the user. So the user says, I don't want my behavior tracked. and that choice only endures for 10 days.
Hmm.
So I've seen that become a huge kind of regulatory action. It costs the business so much money to kind of defend such a claim when you have a big regulator coming after you and wanting to understand, why was the opt out only enduring for such a limited time period. So really making sure you understand how you're implementing the various fair information practices with respect to your product and your practices is very important.
That's a good one, Faith, that I had not thought of. So I'm glad you brought that up with the regulatory. Russ, I saw you come off mute. So what have you got? I'm sure you got a
Oh,
story.
yeah, I mean, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. I mean, just like building products with software, especially innovative, cutting edge products, without taking open source licensing into account, certainly is significant. So the two that come to mind, again, there's many. Like there was the Tesla one I mentioned earlier. Their autopilot platform used lots of open source. They've been facing ongoing enforcement since I think 2013
Yeah.
for their use of GPL licensed software while they were not complying with the terms of those licenses. Another more recent one is litigation happening in Germany, where users were not provided with their open source copyright notices and copies of license terms for use of open source in some Chinese brand vehicles. Yeah, and I guess the other one I mentioned was the Vizio televisions, similarly failing to comply with the terms of GPL licensed open source in some of their smart TVs. And there's
Yeah,
lots. I mean, quick Google search will get you there.
yeah, I remember the TV one because I was like, "Do we have a Vizio?" I don't know. I was like running around like a psycho looking and telling family members, being like, "Oh my God." So that was a memorable one. For those of you at home, we do have our experts on. We've hit about the last 9 minutes, so if you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A. We'd be happy to answer them. While we wait for some questions to come in, I kind of do have two final bonus questions. So hopefully we're up for it. I think looking ahead, there's a lot of trends, right? We're seeing, with AI, different data, what upcoming trends in open source and privacy regulation, like the EU data localization that Ryan had talked about and the mandates evolving in the US, what should developers and organizations be prepared for, do you think, in moving forward?
Yeah, I think AI regulation is going to continue to proliferate. So there's a number of uh, U.S. state laws that are scheduled to come online in the next year. The most significant, I think, is the Colorado AI Act. That law, the implementation deadline has been delayed, but it has been set for kind of middle of 2026. California has regs that are forthcoming. But then there's the sort of looming giant. It's always the EU at the forefront of innovation of
Yeah.
law and technology, the EU AI Act. That is a very comprehensive law. Um, but at the end of the day, these laws sort of focus on the same sorts of things, the same sorts of AI algorithms. And these are AI models that are involved in high risk decision making, material to a person's life. Things like, do you get a job? Do you go to get an education? Do you get credit extended? Those sorts of material decisions being made by AI algorithms with limited human oversight. Those sorts of things are red flags, and there's going to be, I think this is a situation. Law is typically reactive to technology. I think this is a situation where law is trying to get a little bit of ahead of this before it becomes a big issue. But really trying to limit the uh, ability for businesses to delegate such material decision making to computers without human oversight.
Yeah.
And I guess something that businesses can do to kind of prepare for more regulation in this space is um, to consider those fair information practices that I mentioned earlier with respect to the AI. So and also kind of knowing what data would be used. So if it's data about people, have you given those folks a notice? Maybe have you obtained a consent? Do you know what the result is of the algorithm? Is it something that's going to be high risk? Have you given folks choice? And then if it's customer data, so you're a developer, you create something, the customer's data is going to be used to train your algorithm. I'm seeing more customers that are requiring disclosure of whether their data is going to be used to train algorithms and getting a consent from or required consent from the customer. I think if you want to be extra safe, you let customers know that this is going to happen. I mean, not just extra safe. If you want to be reasonable, let the customers know. And sometimes if you're using a third-party AI system, they're going to require that you make a disclosure and get the downstream customer to agree to the terms of their AI system. Yeah. So it's not uncommon to have a licensor pass through AI terms from a third party that is going to be used to kind of process the data.
Wise words. Wise words, Faith. So we did get a question in, and I want to make sure we only got about 4 minutes left, but I want to make sure we have time to answer. When generating SBOM and OSS evaluation reviews, how far down in transitive dependency vulnerabilities shall be remediated? Russ, I have a feeling this might be directed for you.
So, I mean, it depends. I think it depends on which regulations apply to you. Beyond that, though, we've seen a lot on the customer side. So a lot of our clients have their customers that they're responsible to deliver software to. They have additional requirements, and some of them have gotten down to snippet level reporting, license reporting in SBOMs. So I mean, really, it depends on what you're subjected to from a requirements and regulations perspective.
Ryan, Faith, any thoughts on that? Just want to make sure I give you room.
I would defer to Russ on that one.
Okay, I thought so. I just wanted to double check. Okay. So we have only 3 minutes left. So Russ, Ryan, Faith, thank you so much for taking the time to explain some of these very difficult concepts today, and just really highlighting why they are so important. And these are things that developers and security professionals, not just legal, need to be thinking about. As always, we will make sure we send out the recording as well as links to our wonderful panelists. So if you have further questions, you can feel free to ask. To help with some of your licensing issues, though, we do, like I said, have a free resource in the Spectre Assure community where you can look up these packages and it will tell you a little bit of information about those licenses. So that way you can be educated at the time of selection, right? So it's always helpful to have them. And with our safe assessment, you can see if there is an issue with compliance. So quick look, red means no, green means go. Simple, right? So we do have some more insights coming in the next few weeks where we are going over the anatomy of a supply chain attack. That's on the 30th. What could be more spooky than looking at a skeleton of a software supply chain attack? And then if you are or happen to be in Austin this week, I will be at LastCon, so I'd love to meet some of you in person. And as always, check out our blog for more info. Next month, we'll be hitting you with open source maintainers and understanding the burden that they go through and how we can help them. So till next time, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.